Excerpts from Part 3, Chapter 14 of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. Thirst. Phil felt as if he were on fire. The equatorial sun lay upon the men, scalding their skin. Their upper lips burned and cracked, ballooning so dramatically that they obstructed their nostrils, while their lower lips bulged against their chins. Their bodies were slashed with open cracks that formed under the corrosive onslaught of sun, salt, wind, and fuel residue. Whitecaps slapped into the fissures, a sensation that Louis compared to having alcohol poured onto a wound. Sunlight glared off the ocean, sending barbs of white light into the men's pupils and leaving their heads pounding. The men's feet were cratered with quarter-sized salt sores. The rafts baked along with their occupants, emitting a bitter smell. The water cans were empty. Desperately thirsty and overheated, the men could do no more than use their hands to bail sea water over themselves. The coolness of the ocean beckoned and couldn't be answered, for the sharks circled. One shark, 6 or 8 feet long, stalked the rafts without rest, day and night. The men became especially wary of him, and when he ventured too close, one of them would jab him with an oar. On the third day without water, a smudge appeared on the horizon. It grew, darkened, billowed over the rafts, and lidded the sun. Down came the rain. The men threw back their heads, spilled their bodies back, spread their arms, and opened their mouths. The rain fell on their chests, lips, faces, tongues. It soothed their skin, washed the salt and sweat and fuel from their pores, slid down their throats, fed their bodies. It was a sensory explosion. They knew it wouldn't last. They had to find a way to save the water. The narrow water tins, opened to the downpour, caught virtually nothing. Louis, keeping his head tipped up and his mouth open, felt around the raft for something better. He dug into the raft pockets and pulled out one of the air pumps. It was sheathed in a canvas case about 14 inches long, stitched down one side. He tore the seam open, spread the fabric to form a triangular bowl, and watched happily as the rain pooled on the fabric. He had collected some 2 pints of water when a whitecap cracked into the raft, crested over, and slopped into the canvas, spoiling the water. Not only had the most productive part of the storm been wasted, but the canvas had to be rinsed in the rain before Louis could resume capturing water. Even when that was done, there was no way to avoid the next whitecap, because Louis couldn't see them coming. Louis tried a new technique. Instead of allowing large pools of water to gather, he began continuously sucking the captured water into his mouth, then spitting it in the cans. Once the cans were full, he kept harvesting the rain, giving one man a drink every 30 seconds or so. They tore open the second pump case to form another rain catcher. When the sun emerged, they found that the canvas cases also made excellent hats. They began rotations with them, 2 men in, 1 man out. The men were ravenous. It was now clear that Mac's binge on the chocolate, which had seemed only moderately worrisome at the time, was a catastrophe. Louis resented Mac, and Mac seemed to know it. Though Mac never spoke of it, Louis sensed that he was consumed with guilt over what he had done. As hunger bleated inside them, the men experienced a classic symptom of starvation, the inability to direct their thoughts away from food. They stared into the ocean, undulating with edible creatures, but without bait they couldn't catch even a minnow. Occasionally a bird passed, always out of reach. The men studied their shoes and wondered if they could eat the leather. They decided that they couldn't. Days passed. It occurred to Phil that from the point of view of the birds, their still forms, obscured by canvas hoods, must have looked like lifeless debris. He was right. One day, 9 or 10 days into their odyssey, Louis felt something alight on his hood and saw its shadow fall before him. It was an albatross. With Louis's head hidden, the bird hadn't recognized that he was landing on a man. Slowly, Louis raised his hand toward the bird, his motion so gradual that it was little more noticeable than the turning of a minute hand on a clock. The bird rested calmly. In time, Louis's hand was beside the bird, his fingers open. All at once, Louis snapped his hand shut, clamping down on the bird's legs. The bird pecked frantically, slashing his knuckles. Louis grabbed its head and broke its neck. Louis used the pliers to tear the bird open. A gust of fetid odor rose from the body, and all three men recoiled. Louis handed a bit of meat to Phil and Mac, and took one for himself. The stench hung before them, spurring waves of nausea. Gagging, they couldn't get the meat into their mouths. Eventually, they gave up. Though they couldn't eat the bird, they finally had bait. Louis took out the fishing gear, tied a small hook to a line, baited it, and fed it into the water. In a moment, a shark cruised by, bit down on the hook and severed the line, taking the bait, the hook, and a foot or two of line with him. Louis tried with another hook, and again a shark took it. A third try produced the same result. Finally, the sharks let a hook hang unmolested. Louis felt a tug and pulled up the line. On its end hung a slender pilotfish, about 10 inches long. As Louis pulled it apart, everyone felt apprehensive. None of them had eaten raw fish before. They each put a bit of meat into their mouths. It was flavorless. They ate it down to the bones. It was the first food to cross their lips in more than a week. Between three men, a small fish didn't go far, but the protein gave them a push of energy. Louis had demonstrated that if they were persistent and resourceful, they could catch food, and both he and Phil felt inspired. Only Mac remained unchanged. Phil felt uneasy about the albatross. Louis wasn't superstitious, but he'd grown fond of albatrosses on that Christmas he'd spent watching them crash land on Midway. He felt sorry for the bird. Phil reminded Louis that killing an albatross was said to bring bad luck. After a plane crash, Louis replied, what more bad luck could they have?